Welcome everyone. My name is Tristan Claridge and I'm the convener of the webinar series for the International Social Capital Association. The association's mission is to advance the research and application of the social capital concept, and the association is now welcoming new members. In this session, we welcome Dr Jacinta Waugh from Monash University for a presentation about getting by and getting ahead, the influence of informal relationships on the lives of young people leaving out-of-home care. Jacinta Waugh is a teaching fellow and researcher in the Department of Social Work at Monash University in Australia. She completed her PhD thesis on the influence of informal relationships on the lives of young people leaving out-of-home care. And as a practicing social worker, Jacinta has extensive experience working in the fields of income security, community health, youth homelessness, family support, and counselling, in addition to research and policy. Her professional interests and research expertise are in working with disadvantaged young people, social capital, and resiliency. We're delighted that you have agreed to give this webinar. Welcome, Jacinta, and over to you for the presentation.
Thank you very much, Tristan. That was a lovely introduction. I just want to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm presenting today, which are the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and any people of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander heritage that may be watching now. So today, I'm 7 o'clock here in Melbourne. I'm not quite sure what the time is from where you are, but I'm presenting today on the informal social capital and social support of young people who leave care. And what I would like to do in the way of the presentation is to just provide some key definitions, give a little bit about the study's background, just a little bit about how the research was carried out, and if people are interested in my methodology, I can expand on that later, or you can ask questions about that. And then really, I want to get into the nut of it, which is the conceptual framework on social capital, which is the study's foundation, and then provide how I've applied it by some practical case demonstrations and how the interaction of social capital and social support creates positive relationships, and then some conclusions of this. So you can tell that I have actually separated those two terms, social capital and social support, and I'll be defining them shortly. But before I do, I would like to just sort of define a little bit about, I'm not quite sure what people know about out-of-home care or leaving care or what it is. So I thought I'd just let you know that out-of-home care is the placement of children away from their parents in alternative accommodation when they are at significant risk of harm or there is a parental incapacity. And children in out-of-home care are mainly on a care and protective order. And so what I'm looking at is at that time when they're in their transition from care or when they're leaving care, and that's when the state formally ceases legal responsibility for young people in out-of-home care. But as we know, they still really have a real practical need for continuing care. So a person leaving care is a young person who has reached an age at which the state is withdrawing their parental support to allow them to move toward independence. And my next slide, and it's not working. Oh, yeah, it is working. Sorry. Just so I want very quickly, just to let you know the importance of this issue, I have actually given you some statistics. Essentially, in Australia, there's over 61,000 children on care and protection orders. So it's quite a large group of people, and there's 46,000 children in out-of-home care. 91% are living with a relative, or they may be living in foster care, which ordinarily means that they're living with people that they initially do not know. And about 7% reside in residential care, which is supervised by paid staff. as it says here, the statistic here in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, heritage are very overrepresented in Australia, both in on care and protection orders and in out-of-home care. And just the other stat is that nearly 4,000 people between the ages of 15 and 17 were discharged in 2021 from out-of-home care, and 1,508 were of Indigenous heritage. And the other point that I want to make about this is that there are similar trends like this internationally. So let's just go back to the definitions, and these are the key definitions and differentiation between social capital and social support. So essentially, I'm giving at the moment a very simple and probably an oversimplified definition of social capital, but to get us going, it's a good one. Social capital refers to the resources a person gains through other people in their network. So part of being a member of their network, they can gain all sorts of resources from other people. And social support is something different. It's actual, in this study, it's actual or perceived assistance provided by others. So the presence of social capital, social support usually indicates that social capital is present. So social capital can be both positive and negative. Essentially, what this study focused on is the positive actions of support people. So what I did, and I'll talk about it in a little bit, but there's, I interviewed young participants who had left care. I talked to them about what social support looks like for them. I then asked them about someone in their network who was very important to them, someone who was not a paid person, and then talked about the pattern and the characteristics of that relationship and how meaningful it was for them. And there was all sorts of questions about that. And then I asked them, would they mind if I interviewed the person that they were speaking about? And if that person agreed, I interviewed them as well. So they nominated that person for me, and I would then get in contact with them. So I have told you a little bit about my methodology, but I do want to actually say that these are informal relationships. So my definition is that the young person leaving care is in a relationship with a community member who provides unpaid social support. And in the study, it could be all sorts of people with all sorts of roles, including former foster parents or other former carers, friends, partners, other significant people such as, coaches, teachers, mentors, anyone who's outside being currently paid to care for the young person, and that there's actually no signed contract nor monetary compensation for that community member to look after that young person. So the background of the study is what we know from the literature on leaving care, and why I did this and why I'm so interested in social capital and social support is that what we actually know about young people who are leaving care is that often their transitions from care to adulthood can be quite abrupt, accelerated, sometimes compressed. Sometimes it can be extended, but then it can suddenly finish. And the literature, the leaving care literature, calls this an instant adulthood. So essentially what we mean by this is that these young people leave care and they have a whole lot of things that they need to deal with or manage at once. And it can include things like their housing, employment, education, learning independent living skills, getting the emotional support, psychological support that they need. And this is often with young people who, for the reason they went in care, there was trauma going on for them. And so what has actually happened is that when they actually leave that care, often they have to figure out and manage all these things, and often with minimal support. So that's what got me interested in social resources, like the social capital and social support. Is there any way, can these things actually help their transition to be more gradual and to be more managed? What we do know also is that often, leaving care policy and out of home care policy and practice is usually informed by the concepts of social capital and social support. They often, work with people who are giving them all sorts of support and trying to develop relationships with them. So those young people are in a can be in a way where they can take on the support that they actually get from workers or from other people. But what we do know, and what the empirical research said, is often they've got a very varied experience of social relationships. So their resilience can be compromised. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that now. Mike Steen, all these concepts are actually going to come together. So I'm glad you're coming with me, because there's a few moving parts to this. Mike Steen essentially is a leaving care researcher who's done about 30 years of research, a lot more now, of young people who've left care. And he came up with a typology of resilience that, some young people they move on. Some actually, they're in a state of actually surviving, and some actually really, really struggle. And this is actually full of the sorts of elements that are a part of that moving on group, the surviving group and the struggling group. And as you can see, the struggling group often have the most damaging pre-care family experiences. The moving on group usually have stability and continuity. Often they don't actually have frequent placements. They've made sense of their family relationships. They've usually achieved educational success before leaving care. And they have supportive networks. So the thing about resilience that I just do want to make some comments about it. One, I see resilience as something that is ongoing. I don't necessarily see it as just as a static trait like intelligence or someone's personality. Often it's resilience is more of a process that manifests over time. And research actually shows that what helps resilience and buffers stress is actually really good relationships, very good positive relationships, and that these can actually help young people not only to survive, but to thrive. This is an interpersonal process that unfolds over time. So time is a resource, and that's why I'm interested in finding out how can we slow their transition down and make it more gradual. Moreover, with this typology, Stein's research suggests, as I said, that care leavers or young people leaving care in the moving on group are more likely to have those positive relationships. They've often got very secure attachments, and they have strong social networks. So therefore, this study uses this concept as a trajectory for young people. So what I did, it's an exploratory, qualitative piece of research. I interviewed 8 young people, and I interviewed, as I said before, their matching nominated support person when I could. And in the end, I managed to interview 6 matching nominated support people of those 8 young people. And also to get a wider view, I interviewed specialist workers, and I had one focus group, and I interviewed 6 specialist workers because they were able to augment and contextualize the research that I was doing. And on that, I would like to actually just give one very important theme that came out of the workers' perspectives, which really confirms the literature, is the variability of young people when they leave care of their relationships. And the sub-themes were that they had insufficient positive informal relationships. Some of them had quite harmful relationships because sometimes some of their peer relationships where they were associating with people who were needy or more needy than the young person was, got the young person into a bit of trouble because they were trying to help their mate. And sometimes the harmful relationships were about associating with people who didn't have their best interests at heart. A lot of the workers talked about young people leaving care associating with drug dealers, and that obviously wasn't good for them, and that's what some of the workers said. But some of them also said, but you know, some young people come out and they're fine and they have, you know, quite good relationships and they meet really good positive people and off they go. As Stein says, they move on. But I think it's really important about this insufficient positive relationships, because this is what has really got me thinking about social capital and looking at it in a fine, detailed way to see how social capital works in some relationships, which could be quite exemplars, and looking at the interactions of social capital and social support and seeing what we can take from that to replicate it for those people who have poorer relationships. Because this is what some of the workers were actually saying, you know, extreme loneliness is not a healthy way to be. Some of them may miss out on the opportunity to be loved. It affects their ability to establish and maintain other informal relationships. They lack participation in typical social, including relational experiences. They miss out on the opportunity to develop their social skills. If they're missing school, it may preclude care-experienced young people from the benefit of learning how to interact with their school peers. So in comes the conceptual framework that I used. So I got all these moving parts and I tried to put them together, looking at the literature of social support, looking at the literature of social capital, taking Steen's idea of resilience being something that's socially ecological and that happens over time. So the main points that I want to make about this is that I looked at what were the social relations, and of course, in the structure of social capital, it can be that you could be a member of an intricate group or a smaller group. In this case, I am just looking at the individual in the network of that young person, just one individual. And I then am looking at, well, how does this person help the care leaver? And so I look at the social support actions, and the main ones that the social support literature looks at is the practical support, emotional support, esteem, appraisal, informational and companionate. And Coleman talks about social capital is facilitated. It facilitates things like actions. And in this case, it's positive actions. So when I was looking at the literature, I was looking at the different functions of social capital. So what I have here is bonding and bridging, linking, reciprocity, the informational channels, norms, and the effective sanctions of norms. To meet the access. So another main component of social capital is what Bourdieu talks about, the access, that people in the network help other people in the network access resources. So the resources that I looked at for these young people are their developmental needs and their environmental needs being met. These definitions of the developmental environmental resources actually I got from child protection documentation on what they see, what we need to be doing with young people, making sure that they have these developmental resources and that we work on that with them. And when they leave care, obviously they need environmental resources. And this is where my practice experience comes in, is that they need income, they need housing, they need employment and training, and they need to actually maintain their health, and they need access to really good physical and mental health facilities. So I have them as their resources. And then if all of this happens really well, my hypothesis is that they hopefully will experience a more gradual transition. The other point that I want to make about social capital is that it can be hard to see sometimes. There are things that are said here. Social capital, can be an unconscious as well as a conscious repeating of mutual acknowledgement. It can exist in the space between individuals, rendering it relatively imperceptible. And in personal relationships, it can be oblivious to the individual and feel like a normative experience as interpersonal trusting relationship becomes ingrained in reciprocity and end up feeling familiar. Now, what's important about this and why I've got it here, it's this very invisibility that makes it particularly potent for individuals, yet this relative imperceptibility, normality, or familiarity for most people are the very elements that have implications for care experienced young people, which I will talk about later on when we look at some of the themes that have come about. So just very quickly returning to the this concept and analytical framework, what I did is that when I got all the transcripts, I actually with all these definitions, and you'll be looking at some of the definitions that I had for all of these elements actually, or most of them. I converted them into predetermined codes. So when I was actually looking at the transcripts of the young people and their support person, I was actually trying to look for the interactions through the passages of the transcripts, looking through, it was as we say, it was a top-down theoretical approach of looking for the interactions between social support and social capital, and then figuring out, well, how did this actually help the young person? Did it help the young person in gaining any sort of resource? And what I did, and why the invisibility is so important, I wasn't just looking for explicit anything that was explicitly said to me in the way of social capital or social support. I had to look for the implicit interactions as well. So that's what I did. And I can talk about that some more if people have questions later on. I'm just looking at my notes to see if I got everything there for you. I think that's it. The thing about this framework that I really, really like is that it really helped me to examine these transcripts really, really closely, and it helped me to see the more harder to see aspects or interactions of social capital. So the way, what I'm going to talk about now is its application. So I'm doing this by showing you 3 cases, because I think within these 3 cases, you'll be able to see how I used social capital and social support. They are Trudy, who's the young person, and Peter was her nominated support person. There's Leroy, the young person, and their nominated support person was Helen. And there's John and Amy. So we'll talk a little bit. I just want to give you a little bit about their relationship and a little bit about these people. So Trudy and Peter. Trudy, at the time of the interview, was aged 18 and she lived with Peter and Peter's family. And at the time she was studying and she had a part-time job. She had been in foster care with Peter and his family since she was 11. She had a very stable care experience. She had that placement and one other placement. She and Peter see and talk to each other daily, and they both characterise their relationship as father and daughter. Now, interviewing John, he was 20 at the time, and he was living in a supported accommodation. He was unemployed and was planning to study. He had been in care since he was a toddler, and he came in and he had apparently quite severe maltreatment when he actually came into care. But he also had quite a mixed care experience, and he had both foster care and residential care experience. So when I say mixed care experience, some of it was quite good and some of it wasn't so good. But Amy is the person that he nominated, and Amy has known John since he was 6, and she had been his respite carer once a month, and they kept up seeing each other through all the, Amy had got married through all the changing circumstances. Amy got married and she had kids. And at the time when I was interviewing him, they weren't seeing each other as much because he had to move on the other side of town, but they were still, using Facebook or social media, they were texting, they were still seeing each other, and they both see each other as family. Now, finally, with Leroy and Helen, Leroy is 25 and he was living in a suburb of Melbourne, and he was working full-time when I met him. He'd been in care at 16 and he too had a bit of a mixed care experience. He has struggled with poor mental health and homelessness, and he told me that he had a lot of the time he was unemployed, but he did actually have periods of employment and study. He works full-time now though. Now with Helen, he has known, or they have known since they were teenagers. Helen is 27. They both identify as gender or sexually diverse and help each other through tough times. They catch up through, social media, texting, phoning, stuff that you would find quite normal for people to do. They catch up at social events and they catch up for a coffee and a meal, and they both see their relationship as significant and that their friendship as lasting. So we'll go into what these relationships mean, and what I'm trying to do here is to show you how I've applied concepts of social and social support. You may not be able necessarily expect you to read all of these as I go through them, and you may want to use that I've at least have defined the social support and the social capital in the way that I have actually defined them in my study here at least once as we go through. And I've also defined the developmental and environmental resources as well. So when I looked at these, this is what I saw for these young people is that, both Trudy, John and Leroy have got very meaningful relationships with the people that they nominated. And of course that may, at the time it was a little bit of a insight, but of course it can be considered quite obvious. When I look at social capital, sometimes people talk about it as very social capital is utility. However, of course, what I have found that very much so social capital helps with very meaningful relationships. So what I saw here were strong bonding capital and companion support, and also the idea of individuals giving, receiving, and returning. So there was reciprocity capital happening as well. And what this actually helped with was actually meeting the need of actually having a social relationship and someone to rely on and a reliable ally. And it also helped these young people to see themselves with a more positive personal identity. The one thing that we know about some young people when they're in care is that they can actually feel shameful of those circumstances. But with the good relationships with these people, with the mix of bonding and reciprocity and companion support, it actually helps them with a positive personal identity. Next, I also want to continue with meaningful relationships. And with this in particular, it's really interesting, what these young people were saying and what the need that was actually met for them through social capital was family-like relationships. And it's really interesting because when I asked the young person who's important in your life and, who could I interview, none of them actually nominated a biological family member. So, but family, of course, is really, really important to them. So, Trudy says, Peter's like a dad. He's a dad figure. And John also says, Amy, she doesn't try to be family, was part of the quote, but she's basically like family to me, is what he was saying. And what's really important here is that reciprocity that really happens very naturally and becomes quite familiar. And Amy is saying, my children love John. He's been around before them. He's given them bottles and saw them grow up. And so they don't know life without him, really. I think he feels quite connected with my kids. He often rough and tumbles them and tickles them and throws them around. It's quite terrifying, but it's quite normal. It's what an uncle will do. So what we have there is the social dynamic of reciprocity and also bridging capital, because probably not even realizing that she's doing it, Amy is bridging John to her children and to other members of her family, actually. So that's actually really good for John to actually have a wider network. And Peter says of Trudy, which is a nice form of reciprocity, is that, I think Trudy will be like my other daughters. She'll probably come and visit us when we're older, and we'll be grandparents to her kids. And he thinks that, that's how she probably will see it. And he reckons that that's what would happen. And the other thing that I want to show here about reciprocity is what Helen says about Leroy. So it's not just Helen giving Leroy emotional support. Leroy gives Helen emotional support. So, he was around there in terms of believing and cheating from her partner, and he'd listened to me, and he was really incredible. So, without Helen probably even realising, she's actually helping Leroy with and I haven't got it up here, but probably with emotional behavioural development as well. And it occurs quite naturally. So resilience was another thing that I actually looked for, or looked at or saw in the data as quite meaningful. And it was often when the young people talked about what their social support person did for them, which was really just being there for them. Helen's actually very sort of interesting, because I think what she's actually doing there, besides bonding, is that she's linking Leroy up to an organisation that may help him, or organisations like talks about the police and helplines. So these are organisations that are more powerful, and they do have power to actually help people. So she was linking him up. It wasn't bridging him across. She was linking him up to pretty important resources that he actually needed at the time. So again, this sort of emotional support, reciprocity capital and linking capital and bonding capital is really important. And what's really interesting is that the young people were really able to name emotional support. What they didn't name so much was esteem support. That was more implicit in the data, but the support people, you know, it was really obvious to me within the data, held these young people in really high regard and were helping them in the best ways that they could, giving the support through all this lovely sort of social capital. So the meeting of the needs are, you know, social relationships, again, emotional behavioural development and health and wellbeing, all very important resources for young people. Then we get to the normative social experiences. So this is the stuff where it's really invisible. And why I said that before, why it's actually so important for these young people, is because sometimes I think with some of them, it's not so invisible to them. They can actually see the relational advantages that some of their peers have that they don't have. So it is not so invisible to some of them. It's actually quite visible. And it came out in some of the worker transcripts, or what workers said. For example, you know, workers, when they're actually trying to help young people and they may be, you know, taking a young person to school, they know that it's really sort of hard for a young person to introduce them as a worker. It can be quite stigmatizing. So, you know, a worker may say to them, so you introduce me the way that you want, if you want to introduce me, you know, just let me know who you want me to be, and introduce me that way. So it was actually the worker trying to help that young person with just trying to be normal or typical when they get to the schoolyard or school grounds and they're with their friends. But the other type of normative social experiences that we have here is can be going to Centrelink. Trudy actually talks about that. Today it's Centrelink is called Services Australia for international guests. It's an income support government department that we have. Trudy needed to apply for a payment called youth allowance. She sort of didn't know about it, and it was Peter that really helped her with that. So again, he's actually linking her to something more powerful. But the other thing that I find really interesting about this is the informational channel. And, you know, the informational channel is usually an efficient way where information is acquired and where you've got a relationship that's usually for other purposes. You know, Trudy could have actually gone and read about how to apply for a payment, but in fact, it was her relationship with Peter that actually made that whole process far more efficient. So it's really good practical support. And the other one, of course, is John. You know, Amy stepping out for John, how he needed to go and get his birth certificate, which is a really important document for young people to have. And so from afar, she sort of just stepped it out for him. So it's really sort of good informational and practical support. Couldn't be done without bonding capital. You know, Amy and Peter have bonded well with John and Trudy, and they've also, you know, of course, the linking capital is pretty obvious there. So it helps meet the needs for specific care and getting those independent living skills. You know, it is now that these young people know, at the very least, through that informational channel, that these sort of organisations are in existence, that they may now in the future, if they need to use those sorts of organisations, they will know how to maybe do it a little bit better. So the informational channel, you know, sort of invisible, but really important social capital for these young people. So carrying on, and the next one I've got is, you know, the meaning of this data to me is about progressive responsibility. So essentially, you know, it's Peter, and this is a real importance of adult support as well. The one thing that Peter and Amy, I mean, they were initially, you know, Peter was a foster carer, Amy was a respite carer. So they were initially being paid for that work. But over time, of course, that stopped. The relationship is still there. And the relationship becomes more personal. It's more elusive. It's more personal. And the bonding has started to happen. And Peter can actually talk to Trudy about, you know, you go out drinking a couple of nights in a row and you miss TAFE. Do you think that's such a good idea? So it's a really nice way, I think, of the social norms about expected behaviour that adults would have for most young people. And also with that conversation that he had with her, it's quite a good conversation, positive, sort of gently correcting that behaviour, or, you know, people may not want to sort of call it like that, but essentially through that conversation, that expectation that Peter has given Amy is there, which is really good. And what we do know now is that the literature is actually talking about the low expectations that we can have for people in care. And often there's now programs that are sort of named, like there's one in Victoria called Raising Expectations. So essentially we are looking at having good expectations, you know, not exalted expectations that are unfair, but reasonable expectations for young people, particularly these young people, and at the same time taking into account the trauma that they've actually gone through as well. Amy does the same with John. She also is talking about his behaviour and saying, don't you think, you know, you could try this? So she's having that conversation with him. So she's sanctioning his behaviour about being a real pacifist, and, you know, maybe sometimes you need a little bit of healthy conflict, maybe, and you need to let people know what you think about something. So that is appraisal support. So it's providing positive and constructive feedback on achievements or behaviour, or behaviour in any given situation, and it works very well with the capital of social norms about expected behaviour and the effective sanctioning of such behaviour. So when it comes to meeting needs, it again meets internal needs of the emotional and behavioural development, but also what Trudy and John are learning about how they present themselves to the world as well. So social presentation is about the capacity to care for your appearance, your behaviour, your personal habits, to influence how other people perceive and treat the young person. So the young person develops knowledge on how to be responsible for their actions. Develop, again, so the one thing that I like about this concept of progressive responsibility is that it's something that is very much a part and a feature of a gradual and managed transition, and not a compressed, accelerated transition that's instant adulthood. It's not that at all. It's, you know, time to learn this sort of stuff. Time is absolutely needed. So now we have what conclusions can we say about their transition? So with Trudy, her transition is fairly similar to many young people in the population, general population. She's actually had so many, I think, great interactions of social support and social capital from Peter, and probably Peter's family as well, that she's very much moving on. She probably would be in Steen's group of moving on, and she's actually doing quite well. We have John, who also had a really, he also had an adult support person. Now his social capital may not be as much as, or informal social capital as Trudy's. When we met him, for instance, he was very much relying on formal support because he was in a place where it was an accommodation place for young people who needed housing and support, and there would have been support workers working with him. However, you know, the good thing about his support from Amy, and although it's not as everyday as Trudy's, she's actually given him a lot of different support and through different types of social capital. So I would think that John, when I met him and when I talked to Amy about him, psychologically, he was getting by. He was okay. With Trudy, I saw her getting by and also getting ahead a little bit because she was studying, she was working part-time, she was doing the sorts of things that her peers were doing. And then we have Leroy, and Leroy, he for a while there, he was really struggling. But they got into a better place. They were living in Melbourne. They had a full-time job. And Leroy did really rely on some of the support from formal organisations like mental health and housing. But it was Helen that actually helped him get by. And they had a really their relationship, I mean, they all show this, but their relationship was a really nice interdependent relationship. It was like a really good friendship. So there was lots of social support and social capital and a lot of reciprocity happening in their relationship. The other point that I want to make is, and I've got this twice about what Mike Stein has actually said, so I will talk about that quote in a minute. But I do want to make some sort of conclusions about what's happened for these young people and what this conceptual and analytical framework actually meant, because I think it's been quite good. So the conclusions are that for care experienced young people, informal social relationships, social support or social capital is valuable for all of them. Even they all actually nominated the people that were going to suit their priorities. Some of them had more social capital than others, but it was all pretty valuable for all of them. The other thing that I want to actually say about social capital, and particularly informal social capital, and that I've noted, is that the adult support's actually really important, particularly for progressive responsibility, but it's also more continuous. The informal social capital is more continuous and more available and more sustainable than the social capital that they can actually get from workers. Not actually saying that formal support is bad. In fact, absolutely we need it. But informal social capital continues on when the formal support can finish. It's really important to help build informal, meaningful and trustworthy relationships over time, and particularly through those functions of bonding and reciprocity, we can see how helping other functions of social capital can take effect. It helps with creating normative social experiences. It helps with resilience and positive self-identity, and it helps with progressive responsibility. And that happens, all of this happens, can happen over time. The thing about the framework that I used is that it captured everyday moments with these young people and their social capital. I think the people that were their nominated support person, I think Helen and Amy and Peter, I think sometimes they really deliberated on how they could help the young person, but sometimes the way that they helped would have been just an automatic reaction or response to what was actually going on at the time. And the good thing about the framework that's been developed, that it does actually capture the explicit and the implicit interactions. And I'm getting very, very near the end. So I'm going to sort of make a little bit of my little piece of advocacy is that, you know, it's interesting that Mike Steen sort of says one of the things about resilience is about recovery and overcoming the odds. But he also says, you know, we need to actually change the odds. That has to go hand in hand with young people overcoming the odds. So, of course, I think we need to be far more intentional now that we actually know more about social capital in the relationships of young people leaving care. When it comes to their transitional plans, when they are in care, I think looking at their informal social capital is really important, and it should be elevated to equal importance with all the other domains that we actually look out for when we are looking after young people in care. I think sometimes if we did that, I wonder, and this is probably would have to be evaluated, if some of the problems that actually happen for young people, if they do really have good social connections, that some of the problems could actually be that they come up with that really compressed and accelerated transition. Some of those problems could be ameliorated or reduced in some way. And some other points that I want to make is, so what we need to be doing while they're in care, not only do we need to be looking at their family relationships when it is safe to do so, we need to be looking at who's in their wider network, and also trying to create really good positive social relationships. So we need to be investing in community, cultural, and sport, all sort recreational, what do I want to say? We need to be investing in those sorts of organisations, or those sorts of social support for young people, so they can actually widen their network. Because once they widen their network, they can also widen their identity, and they can see themselves doing different things. So that's the main thing that I want to be saying to you. I think essentially positive social capital for young people in care, we need to actually we need their social relationships to be settled, established and settled while they're in care, before they get to the pointy end of their transition and they are actually leaving care. So I just want to thank you all for listening. I want to thank, of course, I want to thank the participants for being part of the study, but I also thank Philip Mendes and Catherine Flynn for being great supervisors and being very patient with me while I covered this very sort of detailed terrain of the social supports of young people. And if you are interested, I have actually written a chapter. This is the link to that chapter on these three young people and the interaction of their social support and social capital and how it actually meets their need. This is what this presentation is based on, is that chapter. So thank you very much for listening.
Great, thank you very much, Jacinta. Fascinating presentation, and it's always really great to delve into the real world experience of people and how they experience social capital, and how we might be able to better understand their experiences as a result of using this concept of social capital. We're going to take questions now from the audience. If you have any questions, please either raise your hand or perhaps post in the chat. If you don't want to ask your question yourself, I'll be happy to read out your question on your behalf, but please indicate that in the chat as well. I might take the first question if I can, Jacinta. The idea of building social capital is often easier said than done. You know, we can say young people should have more of these kinds of valuable relationships, and clearly they should, and that would be beneficial for them to do so. But the building part seems like a challenge. You know, we could implement interventions that could try to do it on their behalf, you know, where we engineer situations where they can meet potential people who could form these kinds of relationships. Or the alternative is, and perhaps we could teach young people about what social capital is and about the value and importance of relationships, and perhaps empower them with the skills and the interest in going out and doing so. What are your thoughts about that? I mean, it seems that's also not an easy thing to do, but what do you think is the best approach perhaps to build social capital for young people leaving out of home care?
I think it is what they have is they have what workers have is what's called a transitional plan. And part of that transitional plan has sort of all those different domains, and social relationships and family relationships being one of them. But also it's about their emotional and behavioural development. It's about their social presentation, their health, their education. I think often what happens, Tristan, is when young people in care have a whole lot of things that happen to them at once. A lot of them actually have a lot of trauma that they need to sort of process. It's really, I agree with you, it's really sort of difficult for them to develop the social skills possibly needed to be able to be successful with their social capital or to encourage that social capital. So I think a lot of the work that we need to be doing is while they're in care, I think we need to be really looking at who's in their network. Some of it could be low-hanging fruit. There could be people out there that workers don't really know about that could be in that young person's network, and then that relationship probably needs to be worked on. It may not always be a good relationship, so sometimes we need to be speaking to the young person about their relationships in their network and finding out from them who they want to actually see more often, who do they trust. And sometimes we probably need to talk to them a little bit about those relationships that aren't so good, and find out if they want to improve those relationships. So I think the work at that level is a very micro level. When it actually comes to a more macro level or a higher policy level, I think there's got to be far more attention on people's social relationships, and often that means sort of investment in getting people to do that sort of work with young people. And it may initially workers may need to be a program within itself until it gets going. And actually, as I said before, we need to be investing in, helping young people widen their social network in the community by investing in, sporting organisations, community organisations, and finding out the young person's interest. Young people do have an interest to be doing, I don't know what it could be. It could be playing sport, it could be drama, it could be singing. Finding out what their interest in is and investing in and making sure that that young person, if they want to, they can actually go and do those things, because it's through that where they'll actually meet like-minded people.
Absolutely. And there are lots of examples around the world of where interventions look to connect people to young people. So the mentoring programs, the credible messenger programs, all of these sorts of programs, the Big Brother program, these sorts of things that connect people. So that's certainly one avenue that we could take. We had a webinar a couple of years ago by Ed De Jesus, who runs a social capital building program in Maryland. And one of the things he does with his young people is he encourages them to explore who is in their network. And quite often we don't even think about all the people we know, and encouraging young people to do that, as well as also gaining some social capital literacy at the same time and understanding just how valuable and important these relationships are, tends to subtly change the way people interact with these people in their life, rather than not bothering to contact them on their birthday or at Christmas, or to get in touch with them for other reasons. Maybe they start to make those contacts, make those connections, invest in those relationships, basically. Like, it's a bit instrumental sort of think about it in that kind of way, but that's basically what we'd like to encourage young people to do, is to value those relationships, to be trustworthy, to be giving, to be caring to others, not just because it's going to serve themselves, which it obviously will when we're talking about social capital, but because it'll serve the other person as well. It's a good thing to do.
That's right.
Yeah, so there's a lot here. I think that with this, there's always lots of different ideas about how we might be able to improve things.
I'm really interested in how the idea of social capital literacy, and how we can encourage young people to know more about it, and how we would do that, because it's almost like you've got to translate English from English, because the language is quite it can be a little bit jargonistic.
Yeah, absolutely. And Ed De Jesus has some fantastic ways to do that. He's been able to design explanations of what social capital is that young people can readily understand.
Right.
Of course, for the Maryland context, the context in Australia perhaps may be slightly different in terms of the language that may need to be used. So I think there's ways to do it, but it's one of those things where we use social capital every day. It's part of our life. Every relationship we have, every interaction we have, social capital is going on there. So for a lot of people, when they hear the term social capital, they immediately think this is something that's new, that's different, that's somehow not what they've done before. But in fact, it's what they're already doing. It's just putting a name to it. And that can be quite a challenge to get that across to people. And so I wonder, in some respects, how useful something like social capital literacy is if you've got to spend quite a bit of time with somebody to get them to the point where it's made a difference in their life. Can you invest that much time with people? Are they interested in investing that much time and effort in understanding this idea? I don't know, maybe there are ways to do it.
No, it could be. I would be very interested in looking at that fellow's the way that they've done it. So I might be asking you for that link.
Yeah, the program's called Social Capital Builders.
Okay.
Should be relatively easy to find online.
No worries. Thank you.
So any other questions from the audience? Feel free to raise your hand or to post something in the chat. If not, I have more questions. Just just give you a moment. Someone's raised their hand.
Kathy.
Kathy, go ahead.
Is it really bad to be involved in the project and be a supervisor and still have questions? Always makes me think. So thank you. I really appreciated that, Jacinta, and really appreciated that extra information, Tristan. I've already just been Googling about that program. I guess I really am interested also in that idea of social capital literacy, because I think one of the things that strikes me is sometimes the more we can put language to things, the more we can start to do those things intentionally. And I think that's kind of what you were speaking about before. People, family members or social networks or whatever can start to think about how I might actually ring that person, or I might do something. So sometimes I think it can give a framework that gives importance to something and a bit of gravitas. But also I think, there's something about having language which means you can do something intentionally, which I think is really interesting. But my question, Jacinta, is I think there's such value in really digging into something and the fine detail and really understanding the connection between things like social support, social capital, and what the impact is. What's the question? How do you imagine, I think, in the world of research, and trying to create impact from that research, have you got any thoughts about how you might share these findings, which are really interesting, with people who may be able to do something with them in a bit more of an influential way?
I only wish I've got to use my own social capital there. I think increasingly, I think I need to be presenting this research to particular people, particularly people who work close to government. I've actually just recently did a presentation with the Centre for Excellence in Child and Family Welfare, and a lot of people there were saying that it was good, and I got a response saying that they found it incredibly relevant to the work that they do. So for me, it could be inching my way into some of these organisations and trying to influence them with this work and saying this is why it's important that we do these things. And I really like the fact that you've talked about social capital literacy, Tristan, because that will be something that I'll be looking at and presenting to other people as well. The other ways, I suppose, besides the sort of normal sort of publications that you do with the research, which get out there. Interestingly, I think I would like to be talking to Philip about maybe using his connections and his social capital of the people that I need to be talking to with this research, because I think within out-of-home care and leaving care at the moment, I think I've hit not the zeitgeist, but I've actually hit a time where I think a lot of people are quite interested. So I need to be doing something with that, but I've got the opportunity.
I think so.
Yeah, the other thing that I was thinking about is maybe presenting some of this work more broadly and have a broader audience through talking to people about maybe animating some of it. So there's sort of different levels, I suppose, that I need to work on.
And it is the challenge, I think, of social capital, that when we're working in an academic space, we're very comfortable using terminology and referring to theorists. But of course, as soon as we leave that space and we're going to work in a practical area, we need ways to be able to communicate these ideas such that people can understand them very easily and relate them to their everyday experience. And it's a challenge, I think, anybody who looks to use these ideas in practical applications has to overcome. And it's even more than that too, because we need the language that's going to work with the young people. But we
Yes.
also need the language that's going to work with the decision makers who are going to fund whatever work this is with the young people as well. And that language isn't necessarily exactly the same. You know, people are interested, like you said, people are interested in this. This is coming at a time when people kind of intuitively understand the importance of these issues that you've explored in your research, but they're not really quite sure what it means and how it works and how important it is. And quite often they want to see some numbers on it and it quantified so they can really make sure that it is in fact important, even though they know that it is and intuitively understand it. And so this is a challenge for all of us, I think, to be able to communicate these ideas in ways that are going to be most applicable and appropriate and most effective to present the kind of change we want to see.
Yeah.
So I did have another related question. Feel free, of course, anybody else to put your hand up or post in the chat if you'd like to ask a question. You were talking about how the lens or the concept of social capital was really useful for your research. I'm interested in your social work space, what other concepts or lenses or ideas have been used to explore similar ideas, you know, to explore how people perhaps transition out of home care without using social capital, if there are in fact any, and what you think particularly social capital was able to show or illuminate or explain that wouldn't have been possible without it. Not an easy question to answer by any means, but I'm interested if you have any thoughts on that.
I think how social capital is really helpful. I think it's a really interesting question because a lot of the young people can come from trauma backgrounds. There's an idea of often that they need formal support of counselling when they're ready to have counselling. And I think that's actually really important. However, I think the idea of social relationships, very, very positive social relationships, can partly compensate for some of the trauma while they're in care if they've got really positive social relationships. When we talk about other type of theories that we use, one of them's called turning point. So when a young person leaves care, sometimes, you know, they've actually been in care, particularly if they've been in residential care. Often they actually don't have the same sort of freedoms of young people who may not be in residential care. And all of a sudden, you know, some of the workers were saying this, it's, oh, we've got all this freedom, we can go and do all these things that we weren't able to do when we were in care. And there were some conversations about sometimes how some of that behaviour can get them into trouble, but workers try to work with that. See, this is the thing. So this is the relationship that workers have got to have with the young people to make sure that as much as possible, no harm comes to them until they actually see that what they call that turning point, when they are actually ready and willing and able to maybe settle down. Maybe some of them actually do come back and say, look, I'm now ready to get some counselling, or I'm ready now to settle down in a house with other people. I'm ready now to be sort of going back to school. So often that, Tristan, is actually done by workers. And I think that last question, what couldn't be done, I would say, is the informality. I think the informal relationships are really, really important, because that's the stuff that I think that we need to bed down before they leave care, to have really important informal social relationships, because I think that's going to be more sustainable after they've actually left care. Absolutely know that relationships are fragile, know that relationships can actually break down, but they all can also be repaired. And often when they are repaired, they actually become stronger. And often that can actually happen informally. And what the research showed me is the richness of really good informal social relationships, particularly with adults, that for workers, it just, I don't think they could do as much because they don't see the young person on a daily basis. But positive informal adult care, they do see people on a daily basis. So they've got that relationship and that social capital just happening naturally.
Yeah, precisely.
Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, no, it really does, because it's those informal relationships that seem to have the most impact for young people. Because I imagine the more formal relationships can still provide information flows and maybe even reciprocity and link them to information about government departments and all of those kinds of things quite easily. But I think it's a lot of the, perhaps what I would describe as the non-action based outcomes, you know, the feeling of belonging or the feeling of self-worth that doesn't require an action on the part of the other person in order to produce that outcome. You know, the existence of the relationship and how they know they feel about each other, which produces the outcome without an action having to take place. And this is something that I think is relatively unexplored, even within the social capital literature and research, is the ways in which those non-action based outcomes can produce the kinds of outcomes that we're interested in. And they seem to be coming out quite consistently in your research as a really important theme.
And Tristan, I wish I was there listening to you in my discussion because you've said it very well. It's quite well said. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, good. So any other questions from anybody else? I feel like I'm absolutely hogging the question time at the moment. So feel free to raise your hand or to post a question in the chat if you have one. Doesn't sound like we have any more. I'll just give you another moment in case you think of something. Because I do have one more question for you. All right, I'll ask mine, and then there'll be time for anybody else if they want to ask one more afterwards. So you talked about how it's quite imperceptible, you know, it's difficult to observe. And I think from what the research that I've done, quite often participants aren't aware themselves of what social capital they have. We sort of talked about that a little bit earlier, but they're also not aware fully of the benefits they obtain from it as well. They might think that they did something because it was just logical to do it, but in fact they're influenced by or supported by an informal relationship, which contributed towards them doing it in a really important way. So I was interested in your research on what you did, or if you did anything, and how you were able to encourage the participants to explore what those issues were. I imagine you were doing interviews, weren't you? So you were just able to, through that semi-structured process, to encourage people to delve into and explore those, you know, imperceptible kind of aspects of social capital?
Yes, it was like that. I did sort of explore a little bit further. So, for instance, with Trudy, when she was talking about Centrelink, I said, so, yeah, tell me what happened. Tell me how that process took place that you were able to get on income security. And through that question, it was something like that, she was able to then tell me, well, this is what Peter did, this is what I saw him do. And I said, oh, so, and it's really, I mean, I didn't want to actually put words into her mouth because of course, you know, we're trying to be, get the information that we need, but at the same time, delve a little bit deeper. But what I could see through that example was the role modelling of the informational channel or that lovely social capital happening. And I don't think she really sort of realised that until I asked her that question of, tell me what you saw. How did that come to be that you were able to go to Centrelink and get the year allowance?
Yeah, and that really reflects that kind of pre-reflective nature of social capital, that we don't necessarily even really understand just how important it is or how it functions in our life without reflecting deeply about it first. In the past, I've tried doing things like holding 2 interviews, one where I explore it relatively superficially and then give them a week or 2 to kind of let it mull over and think about it, and then interview a second time to really try and dig into it. And I found that to be somewhat effective, but quite often people will finish the first interview and then just go about their daily life and maybe not give it one more thought. So no further reflection occurs. So, I mean, having done that research, do you have any ideas about how we might be able to do research that can get into that pre-reflective nature of social capital?
Oh, I think that's a question. Yes, that's probably that's a very good question. It's probably something that I would talk to you about Tristan, because I'm not quite sure, but I'd love to. Be very interesting to do that sort of research and try to show or explain to people how social capital can actually work in that way without people sort of realising that it does work for them, and then showing it to them and making it far more explicit. I'm not quite sure how you'd go about doing that. I would need to think about it.
Yeah, I think it's something for all of us to think about. I think anyone who's researching in this space and wants to dig into those pre-reflective aspects, it seems like a challenge. And I think there's a few ideas out there, like the idea of doing 2 interviews. But perhaps somebody will come up with something that's even better than that. All right, last opportunity for questions. Anybody? Free to raise your hand if you have one.
I'll chip in there, Tristan, just because you raised a really interesting question I've been thinking about, and it's just I guess the matter of I think 2 interviews, it would be really interesting, because I've been interviewed about 3 times in the last 2 weeks from other researchers, and I've always, as you said, come up with other interesting things afterwards, which I've then put forward. But what can we do to actually make people actually think a bit more in depth before the actual interview? So is there any particular exercises or videos or, reflective type of exercises you could actually invite people to do, which aren't particularly too time consuming or too difficult to do, which sort of set people up to sort of give them a chance to reflect beforehand. So I think it's a really interesting, would be an interesting piece of research to do.
I think it's a great idea, David. I've used a primer before, where it's a very short document that introduces the idea of social capital in a way that they can readily understand, to hopefully get them to start thinking about it. But your idea of incorporating some sort of an activity or exercise into that, where they really engage with it, sounds like it would be even more effective.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's very good, David. David, that just reminds me of a piece of research that I read recently, where the researcher got the young people to pick a important artifact, something that was in the house, teddy bear, doll, or whatever, that was actually important to them, that reminded them of someone who was important to them, like a grandmother. I'm not quite sure if that would get them into the pre-reflective state, but it certainly gets them sort of talking about the importance of that person to them. That could also be something that researchers could do too.
Absolutely. Isn't it great we've been talking about Bourdieu and habitus without even using the term habitus? Pre-reflective nature.
Yeah, until now.
That's right. I've ruined it for everybody. Just wanted to make the connection though. So let's bring it to a close there. Really appreciate your time, Jacinta, in giving this webinar. It's been fascinating. The discussion's also been fascinating. We really appreciate it. This is the last webinar for the year for us. We've got various webinars lined up for next year. We've got Professor Robert Lee talking about entrepreneurship in late January. We've got Florian Grissel talking about resolution of disputes. We've got James Hale looking into cultural capital in community development and various other webinars that I hope you'll all be able to join us for in the new year. So thanks again, Jacinta. Let's leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity. Good on you. Thank you, everyone.